Zuber-Skerritt, the producer of a series of video programs on postgraduate research, supervision and training. This video series has been produced simply from recordings of a residential staff development program on postgraduate supervision for women held at the Twin Waters Resort on the Sunshine Coast of Queensland in April 1992. The aim of this series is to provide supervisors and postgraduate students with resources to understand and improve postgraduate studies in their department or institution.
I have three objectives with what I want to do today, and what I'm going to try is simply to introduce a few things to you. There's no way we're going to cover the whole heap in one shot. There is a fair bit of a mythology about what examiners actually say, and I did a while ago do a review of a lot of examiners' reports, and the first thing I want to do is cover what we discovered by reading those reports. The second thing I want to do is to introduce the genre study approach to teaching writing. Now, I won't be able to do the whole lot, but I want to put up two different ways that people approach teaching writing, because you as supervisors may be able to help your students if you can sift, collect, combine those different approaches. So the first one is genre study, and I'll explain what that means. And the second one is to introduce the problem-solving approach to teaching writing. So at the end of this workshop, I hope that you're going to be able to explain to your students a bit better what examiners are looking for. I hope you'll be able to construct some activities, possibly in workshops for students or something, which are aimed at assisting postgrads with their various aspects of their thesis writing and approaches to it. And I hope that you'll be able to access some of the resources that are available to those of us who need to help students with their writing, even though we have never learned ourselves how to teach writing. I was an English teacher. I was never taught to teach writing. I mean, that's just one of the facts of life. It's assumed that anybody who ever taught English at any stage knows how to teach writing. You don't. You know how to teach critical writing about literature. And probably you don't even know how to teach it as writing. You know how to teach criticism. And that's a big difference. So that's what we're aiming for today, as rapidly as we can get through it. All right, when we reviewed these examiners' reports, we looked at 58 closed student files. I got permission to read confidential material on the assumption that I was going to be really careful about not letting anybody know who was involved in various cases and so on. These were closed files, students who had completed and left the university. 26 of them were PhD students and 32 were masters. There were 2 or 3 examiners per student, so I wound up reading 139 examiners' reports and trying to make some sort of tally sheet that gave me a handle on what they were saying and what they were dealing with. One thing that you probably want to know to tell your students, this is the first thing they ask when you've done an exercise like this, is how many students passed. So I'll just go through the results quickly first, and then we'll start talking about what was in those reports a little bit more. 36 students passed on their first submission. It is not uncommon to ask students to resubmit, to tidy up. Now, sometimes that's a very, very simple tidy up. But you really need to prepare students for that. It could be just a matter of correcting typographical errors or something. Or it could be a matter of having to do a really extensive rewrite of a section or a reorganization of the whole thesis, which could take 6 months or longer even. Rarely do you get somebody being sent back to do the whole thing over again. But you can wind up having students get sent back to do something more. Now, if you're an experienced supervisor, you may have run into that. The trouble is that if you don't warn the students that this can happen and that they can have that little extra glitch and just a little bit more work to do. Some of them get incredibly discouraged. Anyway, after those 36 passed on the first submission, 17 more passed on resubmission. One chose not to resubmit. And that one I thought was one of the sad things, and that's part of why I warn you to set your students up for the possibility of having to do that cleaning up kind of rewrite. Because that one person who chose not to resubmit because he was so upset at being told that the thing wasn't perfect, and he said, well, is there any guarantee that I'm going to pass if I do this extra work? And people said, well, no, we can't guarantee that, but it's highly unlikely that you'd fail at. They wouldn't have asked you to do any more if it was going to fail. But we can't promise you anything. It's part of the procedure. And we can't make that promise until we see the thing. And he said, that's it, I'm not interested, and walked. And I thought that was really, really sad when I read that file, because there was no evidence that that student wouldn't have got the degree. And you know, that takes a fair bit of sensitivity and care and things like that in negotiating with the student and creating a climate in which they feel they're going to get on. One of those students was awarded a lesser degree. The thesis just wasn't substantial enough for a PhD. But they said it's a really good solid master's, and they gave the lesser degree. There were 3 failures. I don't know whether that is a good statistical sample or anything like that. 60 students over a period of time in one institution. Now, I can talk a little bit about those failures because I think as cases they're quite revealing. One of them was a student who probably should never have been admitted in the first place. Had a history of having attempted an honors master's, a master's by research, and having been awarded a pass master's. So he completed what was supposed to be a research master's at an honors level, but they said, well, it's not quite honors. We'll give you a pass master's. Had some language problems, was not a native speaker of English, and still had some language problems. Took on a topic that was political dynamite within the discipline. I mean, there was just a string of things, and it was tied up with a department being under pressure to increase its research output and to have more students. And they thought, well, this person's been coming along, you know? Each step has been an improvement. Why should he not be able to? But inexperienced supervision, I mean, even though the supervisor was a very experienced academic, inexperienced at supervising, left alone, no group supervision, no backup, no extra person to talk to. There are a whole string of things that happened. And, well, some of you will have been through a case study workshop that I do, and in fact the case is partly based on that particular one. What happened in the end, really, was that the student didn't hear the supervisor's advice. And the supervisor felt that the student had just not heard what he was saying through the whole period of enrollment. Now, that can be a combination of the student being somewhat vain and the supervisor failing to be tough enough and say, this isn't working. But it's very hard to do that when you're by yourself, which is one of the reasons that I like having at least a co-supervisor or a backup or another panel or somebody. Because when you're in trouble, it's very hard to deal with it alone. You're never sure that your judgment is the same as everybody else's judgment. The second one who failed at PhD level was somebody who knew better than his supervisor and refused to accept advice about methodology. Said, I make my living doing this. Went ahead and did the project the way he wanted to do it, ignored his supervisor, ignored 2 others that were called in to advise him, and said, I'm going to submit it. and got slammed for poor sampling, poor questionnaire, the whole business. It was just, but it was a student who refused to take advice. Now, I don't know why that department didn't say, we won't handle this anymore, because it looks very bad for the department to have a student go ahead that way. I'm still don't know why the department didn't say to the student, if you can find somebody who will supervise this thesis the way you want to do it, that's fine, but we won't. But if you've got a student that's refusing to take advice, I think you've got to start thinking hard about what you're going to do about it. And I always say to students, if you've got a supervisor saying to you something, you know, really point blank, that they don't think this is a good idea, for God's sakes, listen. Get other advice, get third and fourth and fifth opinions if you want, but for gosh sakes, listen. Don't think you necessarily know better. It's very risky and very dangerous. Anyway, so that's pretty much what the materials said. What I was most interested in at the time was trying to find out what the comments revealed about what examiners were looking for, trying to derive some criteria to explain to students what it is that people are after. That wasn't quite as easy as it seemed at the time, but I did get some things that were revealing. I mean, one thing that you've got to recognize at the very beginning, and if you've never sat on a higher degree committee and read the reports, is that they don't always agree with each other. And that's what your higher degree committee or your postgrad studies committee or whatever is there for, to weigh up the differences and to decide whether the conflict is so great that you need another opinion, or whether you've got to ask the student to do some more work in one area and not in another, and all of that. And that's not an easy argument or an easy decision to be made at those higher degree committees, but that's their job. So in trying to set your students up for understanding what they're going to see at the end of this, you've got to warn them that in fact one examiner may love Chapter 7 and one may loathe it. And that's the way it is. And that doesn't necessarily mean you fail. It just means that the higher degree committee has to sort something out and decide which set of comments make most sense. That was a problem with that student who shouldn't have been there in the first place and wound up failing, because the examiner's reports really were at odds with each other over some particular details. And the student argued that if they couldn't agree with each other, then the university had no right to fail him. Now, what they all said, though, was that the thesis was thin and repetitious, and there just wasn't enough in it. But when he started reading the particular comments, he said, well, they don't agree with each other. One of them really likes this bit, and another one hates that bit, and how can you do this? And it's very difficult one to explain. What the examiners almost always put the emphasis on is issues of content over research method, over style of presentation, over everything else. I mean, it's the big issue. What's it say that's important? Now, that sounds like it should be perfectly obvious, but it isn't. The most serious fault they talk about is the failure to take a stance, to reach a conclusion, to, in the words of postgraduate study, to have a thesis. Students have a wonderful armory of data and literature and great stuff, mountains of it, but they haven't pulled it together and made a thesis out of it. It doesn't have a perspective, it doesn't have a theme, it doesn't have a focus. And that's the most serious fault. That's the one that really gets to people. And that's the one that happens when students write at the end, throw things together and turn it in. I wanted to run through all your booklets and cross out the word up after writing, because it's not writing up a thesis. It is writing a thesis. Writing up suggests that you collect the data and then you write. And that is an image that's even perpetuated in that SERC book that's being distributed, where there's a suggested how long it takes to write the different sections of a thesis. I don't like that at all. I mean, it really, really bothers me, because it seems to me that what happens to a student who tries to work that way is that they just dump everything. And it doesn't have coherence and structure. It hasn't been thought through. Good writers often say things like, I didn't know I knew this until I tried to write it. It's about recording the processes of your thinking, and not, you're talking about at least 3 years, usually 5 to do a PhD. If at the beginning you're thinking, I want to do this, and I'm going to do it that way, and you explore a byway, and you reject that byway, 2 years later you may well have forgotten why you rejected it if you haven't written down the choices that you made and why you made them. And you can wind up going up the same dead alley 6 or 8 times over a period of time in your thinking. And each time it can take an extra week or so to sort it out, and you wind up in extending your enrollment and not being able to write that section of your thesis, whether it's methodology or some choice about critical method or whatever. You'll have more and more trouble writing it at the end, the farther away you get from those decisions. So it's a matter of writing through the thesis, using the writing to help you clarify your thinking. Writing's the most important tool anybody has as a learner. And most of you have probably discovered that. If you think about it, you're probably writing little scraps of notes to yourself all the time. They don't look like real writing because they're not sentences and paragraphs and beautiful articles. But you're probably constantly writing just to keep in touch with the material, to sort out your decisions, to work out the logic of what you're doing in a complicated way. So that's, I think this notion of writing up leads to this problem of a lack of focus in things, because the student just doesn't have the time to use the writing to find the focus. And it's getting that focus, getting that thesis, that turns it from just a piece of research into something quite fine, that really does advance the discipline. Also of concern is poor sampling, poor research design, and weak statistics. Now that happens in almost everything except English Lit that I read. And even there, once in a while, people start using computer techniques to analyze text or something, and somebody with better knowledge of the techniques will say, no, it just didn't work. So your students need to be warned to take good advice and to learn what they need to know in order to analyze the data and present it well. The literature review gets a fair bit of attention in the examiner's reports. It's very important that it be pertinent, critical, and up-to-date. Now, if you, as most of us do, say, start reading now, clarify your project, get things, get your bearings on what's being done, what's been done, and how it's been done, and then clarify your project topic, your definitions, and how you're going to deal with things, and clarify your methodology, and so on. And then the student sort of has a draft lit review and lets it coast until the very end to update it. They're likely to A, miss something, or B, lose the focus. A science-oriented friend of mine talks about a thesis as telling a story, but leaving out a lot of the bits. And that's part of the game, is learning what to leave out. What you leave out may wind up making a couple of good papers, but it's learning what to leave out so that you've got to focus. Because examiners absolutely loathe repetitive, circular, and overly long theses. One of the problems with handing a student somebody else's thesis and saying, this is it, this is a good one, it passed first up, examiners loved it, is that they tend to go, and they look to see how many pages it was. And they say, oh, well, if that was 475 pages, if I do 500, I should have enough. And if you look at a shelf of theses in a library, they are tending to get fatter and fatter. Many disciplines just talk about this sort of creep in the size of the thesis. And it really, truly, have you ever seen that happen? Your students?
Oh, it has happened, but in many disciplines it's turned around. It's just examiners have got so nasty.
Good. I mean, I think that's great. Yeah. But it takes an experienced supervisor to know that the trend is going the other direction and that the examiner is getting really upset about it. Or it takes knowing what lies behind a whole set of reports like this. So, you know, this is part of becoming a really good supervisor, is knowing these things and making sure your students don't get them by osmosis or at the wrong moment. Getting this business about it being repetitive and circular, that's part of not having a focus, of not knowing what you're really saying. But it's also part of not taking the time to edit. Of course, the other thing that happens to most of us is that our students, bless their little souls, give us sections of theses, which we see and they look okay. Everything's seems to be going along quite nicely, thank you very much. And then we get the whole thing, and we discover that the whole thing is just full of the same thing over and over again, because we've read it in chunks, we haven't seen it in one bit. So we're not in a position to give them really good advice about editing the whole thing, because often we don't see the whole thing as a whole until very late in the piece. And that's another reason I don't like that sort of notion of writing up and doing it all at the end, because there's not anywhere near enough time for serious editing. Have any of you ever rewritten your theses, your own ones? I mean, I did. I got lucky and my PhD was accepted by a publisher. But a couple of years after I had written it, and I started reading it thinking I'd just do a little bit of tidying up here and there, and I thought, oh my God, this is awful. And rewrote it. It took 6 months of hard work to rewrite that thesis so that it was still not the best book that I've ever read, but it's a lot better than it was before. And it took distance. I had a break from it, so I read it as if it were somebody else's work. Now, our students aren't going to have that luxury, but we've got to encourage them to have the time to put the pieces together, which means they've got to be writing sections at each stage. I mean, if you're talking about writing an essay, you know that there's one paragraph that will have to be there. My favorite example is the question that says, is the relationship between people and water buffaloes in central Java an example of true symbiosis? And you know that you're going to have to write a description of what the relationship between people and water buffaloes in central Java actually is from the very beginning of reading that question. Well, you can write that bit anytime. Answering the question about whether it's really a symbiotic relationship, it takes a lot more reading and understanding of symbiosis and so on. But you know there's going to be a little chunk that covers this, and that's true of almost all your thesis work. There's got to be a chunk that covers this, that, and the other thing, and you can get those written while you're at the stage that in the research where it's logical to write them. Then you start putting the pieces together. But writing up is anathema to me. Absolutely.